matter what you do today, data is part of your job. Whether you're in UI UX, a graphic designer, a sales professional, marketing professional, even a professional streamer, getting data is and understanding data is no longer a nice to have, it is a need to have in the corporate market. Today we connect with Pete, the founder and CEO of Mozart Data. Really what's interesting about today's conversation is really Pete's story. How he goes from the academia world, getting a PhD in behavioral economics, understanding the purchasing behavior of individuals within movie stores such as Blockbuster, to starting a hot sauce business. In fact, a bacon flavored hot sauce business, to leaving his corporate job during the beginning of COVID to start Mozart Data. What's really interesting about today's conversation is really Pete's journey. Typically, going from academia to the corporate world is not that common. Typically, the career path is very linear, very straight. You become a professor, write papers, and that's your career. But he left that to pursue another career, to pursue other interests. Then he starts a hot sauce business. We speak about the learnings from that, really how he got a small idea between him and a few of his friends to allow to ship hot sauce all across North America. It's really what was the impetus or the change from leaving a corporate, pretty secure job to having his own startup. What's really interesting also is we speak about the insights of having a journey like that brings. Typically when you hear about startup founders, the ones that make the news, or you hear, that 20-year-old billionaire, well, obviously those are the outliers. Actually, in fact, most successful founders and most successful startups are startup people in their 40s. That's what the data shows. And we really speak about why having a great understanding and great insights and having a career in many different fields or having a focus allows you to become a better founder and start a business that solves a real problem. Hopefully you guys enjoy this episode, learn a bit more about data, but also learn a bit more about how anyone can be an entrepreneur as long as you really have the drive and innovation for it. Hope you guys enjoy this episode, learn a bit more about Pete and his stories, learn a bit more about bacon hot sauce, and really learn how you too can create a successful business from start to finish, and really understand that the journey is really a marathon, not a sprint. Hopefully you guys enjoy.
Sure. The elevator pitch for Mozart Data is that we're the easiest way to spin up a modern data stack. What that means is that we basically handle all the data engineering for you so that you can just get up and running without having to face the really difficult challenge of hiring a great data engineer. So in the past, that used to be a really difficult task and a high bar to clear just to start really taking advantage of your data from multiple sources, extracting that data, putting it in a data warehouse, making sense of that data. Now we provide a platform that really anyone can get started with. I'm Pete Fishman. I'm the co-founder and CEO of the company.
So obviously data, very important, very exciting. It's funny how I'd say even through my career, it was one of those things where you always need a data engineer. There was a data people. Now every job, even on entry level job positions, it's we'll say familiar with data, understanding how you use SQL, a little bit of R, or understanding what Tableau or dashboarding software is. From throughout your career, what made you kind of go into the data field? Was it something you've had experience in the past and you said, hey, all these companies need more and more people, why don't we make it simpler? Or were you coming from more of the technical side where you're like, oh, I always compare it similar to finance, where it's very simple, but for a lot of people it seems more scary. So how did you approach getting into the data world? Because there's so many different ways and so many different roles within the whole atmosphere.
Well, those are two slightly separate questions. How I got into the data world and how I got into the land of Mozart Data. So the first thing I'd say is I didn't have some sort of entrepreneurial perspective about becoming a data person. So I didn't say, sometimes people would read a book, say like, oh, the most promising career of the next 10 years was going to be something in the data field, or the most studied field is data, and the hottest field is data. That wasn't really how I got into data. I feel like I've been in the data world since I was 2. And by that, I mean, I've always loved math and statistics. And typically it actually came from a love of like sports and often like, sports betting, right? Figuring out kind of what side I wanted to take in a sports gamble. So that's really where I fell in love with data. And then ultimately I found my life studies went in that direction. So I ended up doing a PhD in economics, which was a glorified sort of way of saying I spent a lot of years doing a lot of statistical work on topics that I thought were interesting, that were all about trade-offs. And I actually studied behavioral economics, the overlap of psychology and economics. So I didn't sort of find myself in the data world very intentionally. I intended to be actually a teacher, a professor.
Mhm.
But ultimately, I really found myself loving working with data sets, loving sort of finding the insight in that data. But that had been true in my sort of outside of work world. And then it happened to become my actual profession. Then on the Mozart side, how that got started was a little bit more entrepreneurial, which is exactly the insight that you mentioned that you see in um, a lot of fields, which is to the outsider, they're incredibly daunting. If you look at finance professionals and you see the way that they zip around, Excel without even lifting their fingers up off the keyboard, you might say that that's an impossible skill that I could never learn. It's like learning to do sleight of hand better than a
Yeah.
Las Vegas magician. And it's like, actually, not really. The hardest thing, like anything, is really getting started. And then actually, once you learn that language of finance, learn that language of data, it's actually very intuitive. Um, it's all about sort of overcoming that initial hurdle. So that's where we saw an opportunity. So, when you think about sort of data, there is this sort of, I call it, a wave behind it, a tailwind, where there's all these roles, even entry level roles that data fluency is no longer a nice to have, but an expectation.
Mhm.
And it used to not even be a nice to have; it used to be an unbelievable to have. And now data fluency is very standard across a number of different jobs. But data engineering fluency isn't, mostly because it is a higher bar. There is a different level of expertise and understanding and table stakes to get there. And you don't spend a lot of your real world time thinking about data engineering in the same way that you do data fluency. I mean, whether or not you're picking, I'll call it like a soda at the supermarket, or whether or not you're solving the lifetime value of a customer for a B2B business, you're always involved in some sort of data
Mhm.
trade-offs. And that's something that basically, I think there's a huge population of folks that are becoming at least basic on data fluency, and
Mhm.
often many much better than basic, but they don't have those data engineering chops. So we wanted to make the bar data fluency in order to take advantage of data, as opposed to both data fluency
Mhm.
and data engineering fluency.
Mhm. And that makes a lot of sense. One thing that's just kind of came to my mind, which is super interesting, is obviously data requires some understanding of numbers, a lot of data, for lack of a better term, for you to have value from data, you need quite a bit of data typically.
Mhm.
Startups are notorious for having typically very little data or very little tracking
Mhm.
in the modern world. And it could just be the type of industry also, but typically when I've ever worked with a startup, it's, you ask them, oh, how many, what's your, lifetime value of your customer? What's this? And they'll say, I don't know. Check our emails. When you were starting the business, obviously having understanding of data, having understanding of how to use numbers, was that a hard transition coming from, I guess, more of the corporate world to a startup world, not possibly not having all the numbers you'd typically want, or was that pretty seamless for you to kind of transition and start collecting from the beginning?
Yeah, I mean, again, just to back it up all the
Mhm.
way to my graduate degree, I spent, college was the best 10 years of my life in some
Yeah.
sense. So, and I spent the last six of it working on my dissertation,
Mhm.
my doctoral dissertation, and then so much of that was essentially being really, really precise in
Mhm.
my estimates of the effect of something in a data set. And um, what that did was that gave me the training on how to estimate something precisely, how to spend a lot of
Mhm.
time and energy and effort into measuring something precisely.
Mhm.
In the real world data sets, you very rarely have the ability to measure something very, very precisely. Directionally, even even as good is lucky when you can do
Mhm.
that. So, I think there's a general struggle that a lot of, like, sort of, I'll call them reformed academics
Yeah.
like myself, have in that transition from trying to measure something very scientifically and precisely into measuring something directionally correct so that you can make an important
Mhm.
business decision off of it. For me, Some of that was difficult. Some of that was actually really seamless. I think it sort of relates back to how I apply data in my real life, whether again that's walking store aisles, or whether that's watching a football game, or
Mhm.
whether that's making some other life trade off.
Mhm.
This all sort of connected to the ultimate work that I got to do. At first the later stage startups that
Mhm.
I worked for, then the larger companies that I worked for, and now the early stage company that I
Mhm.
worked for. The other thing I'd say is, also going back to grad school, I did a PhD and a dissertation on video rental stores. So that dates me a little bit. That tells you that, like,
Mhm.
I certainly haven't done. I didn't graduate from my PhD in the last 10 years or even
Mhm.
longer. So if that were a hot topic, that tells you that it must have been a while ago. In fact, it was. But the thing about that was that I had hundreds of thousands of observations. In fact, about 500,000 observations. That was the largest data size that I could even fathom at the time, having hundreds of thousands of
Mhm.
observations. Today, even startups,
Mhm.
even early stage companies that have, quote, no data, get hundreds of thousands of observations regularly. I
Mhm.
mean, often, whether that's daily, weekly,
Mhm.
hourly, whatever it is, it depends on the granularity by which they're tracking.
Mhm.
So even early stage companies, you'd be surprised, gather a lot of data, or at least have tools that can gather a lot of data. If you're serving impressions on Google
Mhm.
ads or Facebook ads, guess what? You're creating and generating a lot of data.
Mhm.
So I do see that early companies often, haven't wrangled that data, haven't started to draw insights out of that data, and they don't collect a lot of data when compared to later stage companies, but they're generating it.
That makes a lot of sense. I think that's one of the things also. I mean, there's that classic stat, and I don't know what is accurate. But they always say, like, in this year is
Yeah, right.
all the years before combined times two is how much data is
Yeah.
being generated. And I think even talking to founders who've even had a few companies, they always say, like, 20, 30 years ago, you'd call a customer and say, hey, like, why didn't you like our product, or what's going on? How to law those one-on-ones. Now you can open up a spreadsheet and just figure out your click-through rates, what buttons changing. Just the amount of data and the amount of visualization you can use is heads and tails above. It's almost like a different world. And the same thing with being able to wrangle the data is so much more important now. And the same insights being derived are a little bit different, or at least a little bit easier, even at the earlier stages. And that's that's so funny. Like 500,000 always sounds like a lot till you realize, like, any data set that you can get your hands on, millions. And I remember even, like, through undergrad and stuff, the data sets we were using, like a 101 stats 101. It was like, oh, in your Excel data sheet with 100,000 entries, 100,000 entries, you just run through SQL, and you're like, oh, that's nothing. But then you give that to someone even 30 years ago, they'd be like, where did you get all this? You're like, oh, we just have it. And that's the funny thing. I think it's in many industries, you take that for granted. And it's the same thing I always say, kind of growing up close to the internet, with the internet, I never thought the internet was that impressive. But then realizing anyone who never had the internet, like my grandparents, it's blows their mind. So I think the same thing with data, just the amount of access you have.
Well, sadly,
Mhm.
that those generations are sort of smushed,
Yeah.
because I was the one that was talking about. I'm probably younger than your grandparents, but I was the one that was talking about hundreds of thousands of observations being a lot back in my day. So I'm always afraid of doing the back in my day stories.
Yeah.
But what you find is that actually these sort of generations are almost smushed, which is,
Mhm.
I'm from an older generation where essentially manipulating that quantity was actually really challenging and
Mhm.
computationally intensive, in a way that would almost be a joke today.
Mhm.
So it is really amazing. It is really amazing how many strides the data world has taken in
Mhm.
such short amount of time. The only thing I would say is that just because we have that data, that doesn't mean
Mhm.
that we're getting any more value out of it. There's a new sort of higher floor to
Mhm.
compete with that data. When I think about you know ads in the early days of, say, Google and
Mhm.
Facebook, using data would be a huge advantage, right? So you would do things like understand the click-through
Mhm.
rates of different copy,
Mhm.
or maybe images,
Mhm.
and then essentially leverage that to do your own optimization.
Mhm.
Today, if you set a proper goal, Google or Facebook will do that
Mhm.
optimization for you. So in this case, you have more data. Maybe that was too high of a bar for you to climb.
Mhm.
But today, that's no longer an advantage that you necessarily have if you're
Mhm.
doing it properly. Now you have to, take it a step further. Maybe that's attribution. Maybe
Mhm.
that's understanding, deeper into the lifetime of the transaction.
Mhm.
So I will say that just because it's more prevalent, just
Mhm.
because the quantities are higher, just because the access is more, doesn't mean that it turns into magic. In
Yeah.
fact, often it's exactly the opposite, which is we've forgotten some of the core things about
Mhm.
identifying causality
Mhm.
or really being rigorous about thinking experimentally. And I think that that's where a lot of companies have opportunities with their data.
That's very interesting. I think that that is something true where just more does not always mean better. And I think that's something that's very difficult to understand, especially when you always hear like we need more. I guess in every business, even me coming from the business side, not the tech side, you're like, I need more numbers, I need more data. And when you say that, you typically don't need more data, you need more insights. That's really what you want, but you just don't know what word to say. So you just say, I need more data. And that was funny because working with some, obviously a lot of AI businesses, it's always they always say, I have 100 million data set. Oh, my data set has 1 million images or 2 million images, and then you have a few people who understand it, and they say, are they good? Like, are they attributed well? Are what? Why does the extra 100 like compared to your data set? Why does the extra million make a difference? And a lot of times, those questions it becomes a thing, a race to the most, not race to quality. So that's a very important point you brought up. Where more doesn't always mean better, and a lot of times the noise makes it way more confusing and way too hard to handle. One thing that's quite unique, and I mean, doing my master's myself and doing kind of an MBA, which is kind of weird, I always found, because academia and business or the corporate world tend to kind of have a duality. They're quite different for some reason, it always seems. From your experience, kind of, I mean, it's typically, I mean, it's getting a PhD is quite rare. Having a PhD and being an entrepreneur is even more rare. But have you found that having a little bit more of a rigid approach to learning, a little more rigid approach to understanding the kind of process behind things has given you a competitive advantage? Or how has that, I guess, in your own mind, shaped how you look at things compared to maybe someone else who just really, just only ever worked in the corporate world?
Well, I do think it is a form of training. So, I did spend all those years in the ivory
Mhm.
tower, but it was something where I actually, I came out of it thinking, almost none of this stuff applies to
Mhm.
my first job, my second job,
Mhm.
my fifth job, my whatever job. But actually, it seems like every year I get further from graduate school, I end up having a rosier view
Mhm.
of it in hindsight. But also, I connect the dots backwards a little bit. Like there's
Mhm.
this famous thing about like Steve Jobs, where he talks
Mhm.
about sort of the ability to connect the dots backwards. That he took
Mhm.
the typography class, and then suddenly that ended up being such a big part of the
Mhm.
Apple products. And for me, it's certainly the case of I never really appreciated at the time how much the sort of rigor and challenge of an academic seminar actually
Mhm.
translates into obviously your career, and
Mhm.
part of it doesn't, right? I think it's important to it's not just I wouldn't sort of recommend people to for giggles go get
Mhm.
a degree like that, because it ends up being a lot of time sort of
Mhm.
grinding towards something that I
Mhm.
ended up actually not pursuing. So learning how to write academic papers is not something that I do in general, but some of that training and some of that rigor and some of that ability to stand up
Mhm.
to really tough questions in an academic seminar, that's exactly what you do, whether it's as an entrepreneur or
Mhm.
CEO, but also like what you do in almost any sort of executive role.
Mhm.
So typically, an executive role looks like sitting around a table, having a thoughtful argument about your assumptions
Mhm.
and your conclusions, um, you know, and your interpretation of what's causing what and what you need to
Mhm.
invest more in and do less of. So I think like some of that training ends up really helping me. I have, it's a very rare moment where I get to actually break out some of the tools that I
Mhm.
learned in graduate school, especially now as more of the CEO
Mhm.
role. But but it's certainly the case that I think I got a lot out of those years. I thought
Mhm,
they were also nice consumption. I
mhm,
actually enjoyed kind of getting to study and have that caliber of challenge.
mhm,
That said, it's also the case that I found a lot of folks that transition to the data science world
mhm,
from academics, but also there are great data scientists that have hardly even a high school education.
mhm,
I think it's really it's not it shouldn't be, and it certainly isn't the table stakes for that type of role.
mhm,
But the ability to think critically is sort of universally valuable, whether
mhm,
that's in as an academic, whether that's as a professional,
mhm,
as an entrepreneur, or just in your life. And I
mhm,
certainly had years of sort of watching some really great minds think critically and assess others' sort of critical thought. So
mhm.
I think that that was kind of the thing that I took most from my graduate program.
And that makes, I think that's one thing that is always interesting here. I always compare it to a lot of people kind of looking back, they're like, oh, I would, a PhD, why would I get that? You're just learning more about very specific thing. But most people I spoke to who have a higher, higher education or PhDs, obviously depending on anything in life, how you use your knowledge makes a big difference. But it's this, what you were saying is thinking critically is a skill that is hard to foster a lot of times if you're aren't in those positions having those tough conversations with experts, because that is one thing. Obviously getting a PhD, getting a dissertation is you have to be an expert at something at the end of the day, and that's always challenging. There's a lot of hours, and one thing I regret kind of doing never doing in school is throughout my career never had to write a paper, really realistically never had to do a luckily my master's was there's no thesis, which was great for me because I was really bad at writing. What sucks is I don't really know how to write a thesis, which would translate well into writing a pitch deck, writing a legal documents, writing all these things, or being able to read very dense books. It's one of those things where depending on how you look at something, there's always value there and how you use it. And for me, I always used to say, "Oh, I never had to write a thesis. I'm so smart." And then I realized, "Oh goodness, I wish I really wrote a thesis so I know how to critically write. I know a 100-page paper, which never really shows up in your life until that one time where you have to write a business plan that's multiple pages and understanding how to effectively comb through that all that information."
Yeah. In all fairness, my PhD dissertation was about video rental stores. So
Mhm,
as much as you lament not
mhm,
doing something like that, I don't know that that has that much incredible value in a go
yeah,
forward way. If I can really claim to be a
mhm,
world's expert in thinking about video rental stores, I don't know that that's going to
mhm,
be that particularly helpful for me in a go forward way. That said,
mhm,
um, it was a long and challenging pursuit that I definitely took a
mhm.
lot from.
Kind of off topic, but kind of on topic. When you were doing your dissertation, did the idea of Netflix ever cross your mind, or did that ever come up early in the days, or was this like out of left field that using kind of unlimited rental per subscription per month, or was that kind of still being talked about within the industry back in the
Yeah,
day?
what actually, of course, prompted I studied behavioral economics, which was the
Yeah.
overlap of psychology and economics, and I was really interested in how people behaved irrationally, which
Mhm,
actually I think is a lot of how you have to think as a data analyst,
mhm,
which is what is the customer thinking. So I was really into sort of customer behavior,
mhm,
and this was before I ended up in the sort of tech field.
mhm,
Um, and at the time, what you saw was blockbusters shrinking and Netflix, when it was not
mail.
digital
Yeah.
but via mail, expanding because there were no late fees. There were sort of de facto late fees by not getting your next disc. And and the question was like when there was this alternative pricing model, would users behave rationally to the fines they were getting? And in fact, like the answer is not particularly interesting, but I did spend, many,
Mhm,
many years pursuing this. But the answer is yes, they behave a little bit irrationally, that they take the fine to be more punitive than
mhm,
the actual dollar amount of the fine.
mhm,
And what's interesting is how do you actually, go about and test for that? And again, I think to romanticize the problem, it is a pretty universal
Mhm.
problem. How do customers
Mhm.
react to different pricing schemes? And people think about this all the time. I mean, I run a SaaS business, right? So
Mhm.
how should I price the monthly subscription? Should it be usage based? Should it be all you can eat? These are standard questions that like are going to, even though I studied it in the context of a video rental store, I do think that's in
Mhm.
some sense a joke looking backwards, but it's also, I think, relevant to me in my current life and going forward. Now, that said, I think one of the things that happens to a lot of people in life, and in my, growing up, there was always sort of like a path. There's
Mhm.
like a professional path, and typically schooling was the key to that path, which typically meant, you study, you'd prove that you learned something by taking a test, you'd ace that test, you'd go on to the next sort of professional schooling, and you'd go on to the next professional schooling, and then from there you were sort of granted on the next path, whether that was, be a doctor, or be a
Mhm.
lawyer, or be a banker, or be a technologist, or whatever
Mhm.
it was. And all of this was like predicated on, I proved it here, and then I proved it here, and then I proved it here. And today those paths, sort of have like evaporated.
Mhm.
That actually, that the way that people advance in their careers is so much less linear, and it's less about, oh, you went to here and did this, and then I saw your resume and saw that you did this, and then we're at this company and then this job. And now so many careers look a little bit like my own, where it's zigzaggy, where I thought I wanted to do this, but I learned something and I retained it,
Mhm.
and not all of it applies, but some of it does.
Mhm.
And now, there's a gamble that hopefully I can learn how to apply that same thinking in an adjacent field and
Mhm.
way. So one of the reasons that I did a PhD, to is kind of a cop out, which is like, well, that's going to be the path that's going to lead me to the successful
Mhm.
professor career that would be, well respected, and I would really enjoy it. And then I discovered that I really didn't think that that was me when,
Mhm.
when I was, effectively 30. I said, actually, I don't think that I'm gonna want to do, write these academic papers and have these arguments, as my career. And that inspired me to, make a career shift. It was actually really painful at the time, because again, I was ditching something that I invested so much of
Mhm.
myself into, which
Mhm.
was a specific expertise. And I had to, essentially transition by getting a, what was the equivalent of entry level job. Um, Even though I had many years of training in
Mhm.
an adjacent field. But then quickly, essentially, those skills, sort of played themselves out
Mhm.
into, boy, these are desirable in a different context. And I see so much more of, careers that looks like kind of ping
Mhm.
pongy, like my own. So
Mhm.
that's kind of one major difference, but also one of the reasons I ended up in both graduate school and then ultimately leaving it.
That's really funny how you kind of talk about the career jumping back and forth and having that generalist approach. I mean, I consider myself a generalist, and that just could be the complete opposite. Kind of your story is I never had a focus, so it sounds good to say I'm a generalist because obviously a very popular book, The Range, which talks about the power of being a generalist, how kind of like DNA was invented from two different fields coming together with kind of having a different perspective on it. So obviously, I'm more pro that just because it's why I chose how to live my life. I need some validation, but like you're saying, it does make a lot of sense now with how much. I don't know if it's from, funny enough, the amount of information that's readily available or the minimum requirement being less, meaning anyone can kind of understand a bit about data, a bit about this. It's better to kind of connect the multiple worlds together. I'm not sure if it's businesses are shifting towards kind of having someone who can manage all those different lanes. So there's not a requirement for everyone to have such a focused bit of knowledge. But it's always interesting when talking to people how, kind of looking back, like you said, connecting the dots, looking backwards, everyone's story is a bit different, but that's kind of how you got to where you are today. And the littlest things tend to bring a lot of value. And it's always surprising how a lot of people will say, I did this as a fun summer job. And I realized, oh, I found my passion for something else. One interesting thing about you also is that you had a hot sauce business. Now, that is almost even more left field, I would say, than kind of going into the entrepreneurship and data world. How did that start? And was that your first foray into this entrepreneurship and startup mindset in venture? Or was this something you always kind of did and then just was one of the more successful ones, so you had a business with it?
Yeah. So that was a great part of my career. I ran a hot sauce company,
Mhm,
and the hot sauce company was called Bacon Hot Sauce. It was a bacon flavored hot sauce,
mhm,
which is not a common side career for a lot of like Silicon Valley tech people.
mhm,
So that was sort of a unique foray. A couple of things there that I thought were important. Yes, it actually was my first real entrepreneurial endeavor.
mhm,
So a lot of great entrepreneurs, they get their start at, age 8 as like,
mhm,
they're running a lemonade stand. And then in college, they've got a t-shirt business. And then, they graduate and they've got some side hustle. And then eventually they find themselves wanting to
mhm,
do sort of maybe a deep dive into something like a venture-backed tech business.
mhm,
Myself, I actually always, again, loved the sort of um, love the sort of concept of a very cushy, straightforward job. And it was actually this hot sauce endeavor that actually changed my mind, because my greatest professional highs were not, taking, a product. I worked at Microsoft
mhm,
and, would work on products that would touch, a billion people.
mhm,
And, making those a little bit better was a huge sort of
mhm,
impact on, globally. You could think of it like that. Making one of the office products just a little bit better would have a huge impact. But actually, like what sometimes was some of the most rewarding things was a breakthrough, right?
mhm,
Some sort of and I think like the entrepreneurs you talk to always sort of share the same story, which is just the amplitude of their emotions is and their achievement is just so much higher. Which is to say, your highs are very much
mhm,
higher and your lows are very much lower. So when it
mhm,
falls on you, you really feel that. And some people chase the feeling of the highs, and some people chase the not feeling the lows of
mhm,
the losses. So for me, like, I started this hot sauce company, and it sort of got me out of my mold of, I have this professional job, and then hopefully in a couple of years I get promoted into this higher level of
mhm,
that same job, and then I get promoted into the next level. I look all the way up the ladder and say, oh, I wish I could be like the person that's 3 years ahead of me, or
yeah,
whatever that thing is. Um, there was basically an idea that myself and two friends had, which was the world needed a bacon flavored hot sauce. We were just sort of sitting around eating eggs and thinking, you know what the world needs? It needs bacon plus hot sauce, and like
mhm,
together, and it needs to be easy. And just, it's sort of a lot of the theme of, actually, my co-founder of the data company Mozart
mhm,
Data is actually the co-founder of the hot sauce company. So we have now a couple decades of working
mhm,
together on entrepreneurial endeavors, but obviously two very different ones. But actually,
mhm,
there's something similar. So some is about seeing the opportunity. So we were one of the earliest companies on Shopify, which basically the D2C space. Obviously, I'll give a Canadian shout out here, but the D2C space was something that I think was about to blow up. I think the writing was on the wall that so much of e-commerce was going online, or sorry, so much of commerce was going online, and 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 obviously there are going to be big winners because of sort of distribution advantages and monopolistic advantages. And obviously we have those, right? So like Amazon is a great company, and it's easy to get any product whenever you want at a compelling price in incredibly short amounts of time, and that's amazing. But what you've seen is an opportunity for people that are hyper passionate about something where they kind of see the world a little bit differently, and then are willing to go out and sort of pound the pavement with what I see is right about the world. Right.
mhm,
So what I saw about the world was, these were my two favorite things to eat, and I wanted them combined. And I was convinced that anybody in their right mind would want those two things.
mhm,
And and there were a new set of tools. Honestly, it was advertising on Facebook and Shopify that made a D2C business like that even possible. And what Facebook did was, it enabled me to target and find people that love bacon and people that loved hot sauce. This was actually um, sort of very much in the early days
mhm,
of Facebook advertising. But at the very least, you could leverage those interests, that availability that Facebook had about its users. So I think, the entrepreneurial story is actually one where I switched to that a little bit later in life. So some people kind of, it feels like they come out of the womb, and by the time they're like, 3, that, they've got a pacifier business or something, whatever the equivalent is. For me, it was something that I just felt overcome and felt like needed to happen in the world. And then you really do catch the bug. It can be really, the highs are so addictive. I remember when we got into our first supermarket. I remember that call. I used to get up I live on the West Coast. I used to get up at 5 in the morning on the West Coast and call down supermarkets on the East Coast and try to, speak to the grocery manager so that I could, try to pitch my hot sauce. I remember selling into that first store, all the cold calls and all the losses, and how painful every rejection was. And I think, like, and then figuring out, what, actually, like, the old way of doing it, the sort of, cold calling, while it had its place and had its ability, the old way wasn't going to work for me, and I had to find a new platform, and I found 2 new platforms. I mean, they're not, today, to, like, you'd laugh if I were like, oh, I found these 2 new platforms, you should totally check them out. One's called Facebook and one's called Shopify. Literally everybody would be like, oh god. So I think that kind of challenge was really exciting to me. And I think when you talk to entrepreneurs, they have that. A lot of them really experience a different level of professional high when they have these sort of breakthroughs in their business. And some of these breakthroughs, again, weren't particularly mean. I mean, being in the hot sauce business, being in a food business is a very different thing than being in a tech business. Like, when you're selling a software product like Office, again, a very, very trivial change can have a really giant, dollar-wise impact. But, like, when you're selling a hot sauce, you're not making a lot per bottle. But even just those breakthroughs are really exciting to me professionally, to see it sort of come to fruition.
That's super interesting. I think one thing that you speak about is like the highs being so much better, especially when your own business, is I think one thing that people don't realize. Because I mean, using, probably going to say it wrong, but using some behavioral economics, like with loss aversion, you think that, okay, well, I have to make all these calls. That pain of all those calls can never make up for the greatness of making a sale. And I've worked in sales jobs, and for me, it never was the case. I could sell something, but I'm like, I do not want to call another 100 customers. But even on the littlest projects I had that were mine, it never felt like that. It was just always a goal. For some reason, you always felt like the impact was so much greater. And I think you even touched upon that. Working for a large company, even if you have a greater impact, for some reason too, like selling the smallest thing, even if in the grand scheme of things, whether it be monetary or even success metrics, not the same to someone else, to you, you make such a big impact, such a big difference, and it's such a big win. And I think that is something, like you said, a lot of entrepreneurs touch on, was that most of their stories are things looking at you never realize, like, some being hyper successful and saying, the first sale for, the $10, or, meeting the co-founder and developing our product in the garage. Those classic stories are their fondest memories, not IPOing for $1 billion and all doing these great things, because I think it's the storytelling that's always the best part, having those fond memories. And it could be hindsight, by, looking back, it always seems better than what it actually was. But it is interesting. I always hear that from people that, working for yourself or developing something for yourself, whether it be a business side project or even just a smaller personal project, the emotions are so much greater, so much more impactful, and tend to be looked at way more fondly than most other things. So I feel that's a very common story, but something that is one of those things, like you say, when you feel it, when it's one of those things, like when you get into the zone, you've had that impact on your life.
Yeah,
So yeah.
I think there's a couple things there I wanted to touch on. So the first is, I do think there's a little bit of a hindsight bias, like, and I don't want to say that I don't suffer from it. I think
Mhm.
one of the things that I've noticed over time is I tend to forget the losses, which were incredibly painful. I
Mhm.
remember when I wanted to, ship the hot sauce the first time, and there kept being delays, and I kept having no agency in it, and I would use third party or a co-packer, and I would just constantly disappoint buyers, and and just that would bring me honestly to tears. Like I think you kind of forget, like one of the things that's nice about, like especially if your mind can work this way, is
Mhm.
that you do tend to forget how painful the losses were.
Mhm.
um, and you do sort of, like you said, whether it's because these are the stories you tell. I sort of tell, like, obviously I have a lot of, when you work as a bacon hot sauce entrepreneur,
Mhm.
I call it a bacon entrepreneur. Like when you work, you have great stories. You
Mhm.
have these, like, you can't believe these things actually happened. um, so I certainly think that there is a little bit of that hindsight, but I will say that that's it. But it's real. It doesn't matter. It's
Mhm.
how I experience it. I kind of, like you said, I definitely remember. I definitely remember the wins and the stories around the wins, just very richly and sharply in
Mhm.
my mind. The other thing is, you mentioned like loss aversion. I think that's a real thing. It's actually one of the things, again, I studied
Mhm.
studying behavioral economics, and it is true. Like loss aversion really explains really well why people like don't want to take like little risks, like
Mhm.
they like little risks that they maybe should take, maybe you don't want to take like a bet, or this or that might be even slightly in your favor. But I think like the actual shape, I mean, people, there's an important part of loss aversion, just to geek out
Mhm.
with you a little bit, which is all about sort of, it's really about the concavity of gains,
Mhm.
which is like a huge gain doesn't necessarily feel any necessarily better than a, I mean, it does feel better, but not
Yeah.
significant, not the same sort
Marginally.
of
Yeah.
scale better than a small gain. um, and and it's sort of some of that type of experiencing. I think that there is this sort of what's generally called it's called like a kinked demand curve, that
Mhm.
the small losses are really painful, but to that end, sort of moving from small losses to little wins. And then you experience that a lot as an entrepreneur. It tends to be a very, very, very big utility gain.
Mhm.
So I do think that actually, even though sort of loss aversion would suggest that people, shy away from sort of entrepreneurial risk, or only like freaks that are not loss averse,
Mhm.
or have these like weirdness to their sort of utility curves, are going to be the types of people that can do entrepreneurship. I would say it actually partially explains why some of those little wins that default, your framing is
Mhm.
that it should be a little loss. So that sort of utility delta
Mhm.
really does explain a lot of why the sort of, I made a $10 sale of
Mhm.
hot, I'm at maybe a convention, I make a
Mhm.
$10 sale of hot sauce, and why that feels so great. So that's part of the,
Mhm.
I think it's actually a small part of the story about what makes entrepreneurship so fulfilling.
And I think that is true. I think it's also most of these stories is the framing behind it. It's not that if you made $10, it's the all those trials and tribulations that can get there. So it's not technically monetary. There's a lot more to it. And I always found, and that's where love the geeking out part, because obviously that was a big part of my education as well. Just dipping my toes into it, obviously, and kind of hearing you break it down was, I loved it. Very insightful, but also good way to reframe kind of the idea of a lot of these topics where I found in business I mean, this is probably same thing with data a little bit, where you have someone who knows a little bit and you're like, I understand this fully. I have a term now I can use. And then everyone else is like, well, it's a little bit off. And I find funny enough, it's the same thing when like, I mean, especially within data where you always say like, hey, I always say, oh, I need more data. What do you actually need? You need those insights. And I think breaking it down is quite interesting how you said with the lost version in regards to even those small wins. I think what's the funniest thing is with a lot of these wins, I find most entrepreneurs, like you said, when you're looking back at it, there's never, rarely there's regret. It's always one of those things. It's like getting to the next step. And I think how you said with like the zigzag career, a lot of times people in the moment are like si- similar for funny enough. And you've probably seen this as well when it's like people having children, they always say like in the moment they're more miserable. Every single time you call someone, they're always more miserable. But then hindsight, they're happier for some. It's just one of those things where I think it's in the moment of being an entrepreneur, you're always like, why did I make this decision? This was a mistake. All this pressure, all this stress. But looking back, you're like, greatest decision in my life. I'm in love with where I am right now. And I think it's like anything. It's hard to figure out where you are in the moment. So you go from hot sauce business, bacon business. You're still obviously working in the data side of things. What makes you go from this project to Mozart Data and kind of jumping into a little bit more of the, like you said, SaaS and tech based things that is again quite different than kind of what you were currently doing, both on the entrepreneurship side and then kind of taking a look, I guess, a little bit more of a greater step into a little bit more of a SaaS based product.
Well, I think that like I mentioned, I had always had a love of data, right? So
Mhm,
that started from I like to say started at age 2 when I went to my first
mhm,
racetrack, horse racing track, and sort of always fell in love with the horses and the betting and the sort of figuring and the numbers, um, and then ultimately I started a career in the data space and was able and sort of and that led me to
mhm,
technology, and the technology led me to this sort of hot sauce side project, but beyond that I had really fallen in love with startups, with the idea of creating something, and typically on optimizing, honestly, a mess. Every startup's a
mhm,
mess. I think it's Anna Karenina or one of
yeah.
them that's like I forget the line, but it's the equivalent, which is to say every startup is a mess in its own unique way, and uh, I think like kind of using data to make sense out of what's working and what's not at
Mhm,
the business, and having people invest in more of the things of what's working has been sort of a passion of mine professionally. And then typically what I find is when you do develop something that you're a combination of passionate about and good at, and is like a unique or valuable skill, the thing that you strive for is to figure out how to scale yourself,
mhm,
right? And like you can scale yourself by getting better, by like, okay, I used to be able to do this and would take me X hours. Now it takes me X over 2 hours. And then you're constantly figuring out how to like get 2X better. And it's,
mhm,
it's a very tough challenge as you start to get, better and better. Um, the flip is you can manage people. You can say, okay, I'm going to create a team, and I'm going to, sit on top of a pyramid, and I'm going to disseminate my knowledge, and I'm going to essentially give autonomy and assert myself in the right times and ways to essentially find leverage in those forms. And then alternatively, you can just say, I'm going to build a product that obsoletes myself.
mhm,
And honestly, I've tried to do all three of those things in my career. So I was once an okay data analyst that got
mhm,
better and better and better and figured out how to do those analyses faster. And some of it were automated through tools, and some of
mhm,
it was just I got better at recognizing certain things and pattern matching, etc. And then I actually became a team leader. I hired people and I trained them up, and often they quickly exceeded me, and that was very rewarding too. And now I'm finally trying to just totally replace myself.
mhm, mhm,
And I think finding scale is like the most rewarding thing, because you used to be able to have X impact, and now you figure out how to have bigger and bigger impacts through some combination of
mhm,
technology and other people. So that was sort of a natural extension of the career that I had. I mean, it sort of relates to my passion since
mhm,
when I was like a little kid, all the
yeah.
way through to essentially my training and then
Mhm,
ultimately my career. But like that's kind of how a lot of this comes about. We said, okay, what are the tools that we're going to be missing at our next job that we were using every single day? And it's basically a lot of the data world today and the data tools today. They come from companies that were cutting edge, that were thinking about the world the right way. I worked at a company called Yammer
mhm,
and built a tool that we called Avocado. All these sort of
mhm,
kind of corny names. We loved avocados. We ended up having a tool called Avocado,
mhm,
and Avocado today was basically Mozart Data.
mhm,
Was effectively the inspiration, the idea of centralizing data, data warehousing, and then essentially the ability to transform that data, to clean that data, which ended up being sadly a lot of the work. I mean, people talk about the analysis, they talk about sort of those moments of clarity or insight. In practice, most of the time is very janitorial. It's a lot of cleaning. So we wanted to
mhm,
take the sort of real world practice. A lot of the best data tools, they were at great forward thinking tech company X. They had spent a lot of time and energy sort of building their data
mhm.
systems, their data processes, and they want to now make that available. And this is just a lot of what my story is as well.
That's funny how you say, like, it's when you know what the real job is, it's a lot of cleaning stuff up. I think it's the same thing when people, even kind of jumping back when I was like, when people were talking about getting a PhD, it was always the same thing. Like, no, you do all this research and you develop new ideas, and then you talk to anyone who's in postdoctoral school, and they're like, oh, it's a lot of data crunching, redoing, writing. It's at the end, it looks cool because you have a cool little theory, and you, especially in behavioral economics, people become authors, or there's always like cool, all this one cool theory, all these studies. But most of the time, is well, I spent a year working on this, and nothing came of it. And I mean, it's the same for entrepreneurship as well. You only ever see the successes, you don't see the trials and tribulations along the way. One thing that even you touched on, throughout your career is obviously seeing changes within the industry. Where do you really see, now this is such a general statement, but like, where do you see data going? Obviously AI, hot button topic, neural networks, a lot of this thing. I think it's similar to many other things, is that it's what's actually going on, what it sounds going on a little bit different, but kind of where do you see the industry going, or what do you see some of the big changes are from today, where data seems to be everywhere and it is everywhere, to kind of where it is in the future?
Sure. So I often think about sort of these separating
Mhm.
equilibria, which means that today, the sort of AI world, the advanced machine learning world, the basic data analysis world, a lot of people that do any of these jobs are almost indistinguishable. They have
Mhm.
largely the same titles, and or at the very least, you can't really gauge whether somebody's on one end of the spectrum or
Mhm.
another from their title.
Mhm.
So a lot of what I see in a lot of professions is that it tends to go one of two ways: hyper specialization. So if you think about kind of what like I like to say, I started my career in the NFL, which is true. I did data
Mhm.
analysis for the Eagles. I wasn't a player on the team, but I
Mhm.
was in the front office. And but like if you look at what football players look like, their bodies are incredibly different. Whether you're an
Mhm.
offensive lineman, a
Mhm.
linebacker, a quarterback, a wide receiver, these are very, very, very hyper
Mhm.
specialized. And the same is going to be true in the data world. So you're not just going to have AI experts; you're going to have maybe self-driving car AI experts. So I think I think what you're going to see is hyper specialization on the one hand. And then on the flip, it's the democratization. It's the ability to use the same tools. I mean, if you think about kind of what the workout room looked like for the Eagles when I was
Mhm.
there, compared to the home gym
Mhm.
offerings and expertise that you can get through sort of modern devices. These two things are now essentially peers, which is so it's like democratizing what used to be only for the elite,
Mhm.
right? Only the best athletes in the world had the type of training that were available to the Eagles while I was there. Obviously professional sports
Mhm.
teams.
Mhm.
Today, a lot of that is available through all of these really fancy like workout applications. Not
Mhm.
that I use them, but if I did,
Mhm.
they would certainly be accessible to me.
Mhm.
And so it's sort of like two ends. I think like what you see is this sort of, I call it like a separating equilibrium,
Mhm.
which means you'll have like deep expertise that's trying to solve the sort of academic
Mhm.
problems of the most precise estimates of something. They can make something that is sort of used universally just a little bit better, because that has a big impact.
Mhm.
And then similarly, you're going to see actually that sort of floor for data fluency just keep rising.
Mhm.
That ability to use, in the same way that you mentioned, your grandparents struggling
Mhm.
with like modern tech devices.
Mhm.
They probably, these are very, very sharp people that can't use, an
Mhm.
iPhone the same way maybe
Mhm.
like, a 6-year-old can
Mhm.
today. Right. And that's not a knock on any
Mhm.
on any of it, but that's just kind of how the world evolves. It's like
Mhm.
this thing that's like second nature to, one of my, let's say, like a nephew
Mhm.
that's like, punching around, or a niece that's punching around
Mhm.
on one of their fancy devices, would be almost unthinkable to 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 my
Mhm.
to my grandparents or to older generations. So I think that sort of is exactly what's going to happen. I think data is going to become just a very standard tool in the tool set. In the same way that sort of using email with
Mhm.
incredible fluency is sort of universal
Mhm.
today. And then what you'll also find is deep expertise in advanced uses of data. And that sort of world where a lot of this all falls under one job title, that's now going to, again, separate out into very different sort of job functions.
It's quite interesting. It makes a lot of sense. It's quite interesting. Because you think about initially it was quite separate because tools were separate, where there would be data entry person, like way back, data entry person, analysis, computer science person, all came into one and then back out again because there has to be hyper specialization to get to the same level required to get the values or insights to be competitive in the market. I think that's the big thing. If you want to be competitive, you have to be doing something that's a little bit different than what is currently being done. So, I mean, your story's quite interesting. You kind of did a little bit of everything, but also kind of work towards, even like you said, even though your journey seems like it was zigzag, since the age of 2, betting on horse races to where you are, it's kind of looking back, the story is very linear, even though in actuality it's not linear. I guess the last question to leave it off on is one thing that's surprising to a lot of people is that most successful entrepreneurs start, I think the average age is in their mid to late 40s. That is actually when their success happens, their first $1 million venture. It is very, I mean, quite common comparatively, but obviously it's not glamorized as much because it's super cool to hear about a 16-year-old that made $7 billion. What, I guess another question to say is, why do you think that? I mean, it's kind of a leading question, but why do you think that more successful businesses are started by people who are later on in their careers relative to people who are relatively young?
So first of all, I'm hoping that stat holds true.
Mhm.
Obviously, there's some selection into all of these categories, but so my co-founder and I also started our
Mhm.
entrepreneurial endeavor, not our first one, not our hot sauce
Mhm.
one, but our data one when we were in our 40s. So
Mhm.
we're hoping to fall into that exact success category. In practice, typically when you're starting an entrepreneurial endeavor a little bit later in your life, you have um, a lot of advantages. Some are monetary advantages where you don't have to sweat every single hiccup along the way. Some
Mhm.
of them are, sort of Rolodex advantage. Nobody uses Rolodexes anymore, but the equivalent of Rolodex advantages, where you're able to find design partners or early customers
Mhm.
through past coworkers or past experiences or past trust that you've built.
Mhm.
Um, some of them, honestly, you hope that you learn a thing or two along the way. I like to think of myself as having, I call it like sort of like old guy basketball moves, which is
Mhm.
when somebody comes to the league or the NBA, they're
Mhm.
they're they're dunking, they're jumping over people. It's
Mhm.
no big deal. And then as you get older, you learn how to like throw a hip into somebody at the exact right time, or how to post
Mhm.
up, or how to do a turnaround, or whatever it is. And I think the same is true sort of in
Mhm.
entrepreneurship, which is to say, you've seen often through other people's wins and
Mhm.
fails, kind of what works, what doesn't
Mhm.
work. So um, I think, like, honestly, like, there are huge advantages to each. I think when the if you probably run the math on it, you're right. The advantages of sort of being a little bit more like wily and starting on
Mhm.
second base is actually like dominates
Mhm.
the hunger and the unlimited energy that one has. Sort
Mhm.
of, I again, I wish I could be 21 again, but but I do think I think that there's obviously pros to each, but I think
Mhm.
one of the things that is really important for people like myself that are starting a little bit
Mhm.
later in their career on an entrepreneurial endeavor is that they do have an extreme focus about what they want. I think I started my company April 2020, right at the start of COVID, and I think one of the things that COVID did was focus me on what was really important in
Mhm.
my working life, and I think that's something that generally people like. I think you know when people typically answer this question, they typically default to the way that I answer. Oh, we're more successful because we have better Rolodexes, and we're really starting on second base. It's like that statement's true. It was easier for me to raise money from typically people that I had worked with in the past. A lot of my peers were able to invest because they've had successful careers. So I was able to really sort of deal with the standard sort of startup challenges in a very quick way and save me a lot of time. And that basically put me out, like I said, on second base. But I really do think the thing that I have going for me now versus the 21-year-old version of me, and I do miss that one, is that I do have an appreciation for what matters a lot to me and the type of company that I want to run. And those things are really underrated advantages when establishing a culture, which is ultimately going to be the thing that can differentiate your company in a long run sense.
And I think to end it off, it reminds me of the famous Conor McGregor quote, big UFC and MMA fan here. It says, precision beats power. Focus will always beat energy at the end of the day if you know where you're going. But if people want to learn more about your story, learn more about the business, what's the best place to get in contact, and what's the website?
Sure. I'm Pete at MozartData.com, and you can always visit www.mozartdata.com.